Arriving by bus, boat and even on foot, more than 1 million Venezuelans flee to Colombia. The country is happy to help, but can it afford the kindness? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is Colombia's refugee crisis. His citizens are fleeing starvation. Inflation is expected to soon hit 1,000,000%, and the economy has collapsed. But Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro continues to preach his brand of socialism. The result has been a migrant crisis on par with Europe's 2015 refugee crisis, and Venezuela's neighbors are bearing the brunt. More than 3 million Venezuelans have fled the country, more than 1 million of them to neighboring Colombia. Its president, Iván Duque, says that taking in Venezuelans will benefit Colombia in the long run. But is he right? His country's resources are limited, and the influx of migrants has brought not only rising unemployment, but also poverty and disease. So, can Colombia really cope? Haider Abbasi explores.
Colombia is overwhelmed. Migrants from neighboring Venezuela are pouring into the country every day, and the government is reaching breaking point.
We're not facing an ordinary crisis. On the contrary, we're facing a crisis of a magnitude that's worthy of global recognition.
But unlike many refugees in Europe, these people aren't fleeing a war. They're escaping an economic disaster. In the past 18 months alone, more than 1 million Venezuelans have arrived in Colombia. But hundreds of thousands have also emigrated to several other countries in South America. And this is why they've left. Venezuelans are struggling for food, medicine, and cash.
Emigrating is hard because it means leaving our families, our loved ones, but we do it because it's necessary. It's either emigrate and give it a try, or die there of hunger.
Emigrar.
Venezuela is not without resources. It has one of the largest proven oil reserves in the world. But after the price of crude crashed in 2014, so did the economy. The country hasn't been able to recover, and the government denies that a crisis even exists.
We are not going to allow for isolated actions by government employees, because they've tried to convert a normal migration flow into a humanitarian crisis to justify international intervention in Venezuela.
It's a reversal of fortunes. During their civil war of the 1980s and 90s, it was Colombians who fled to Venezuela to find safety and work. So Bogotá feels it should reciprocate. But it hasn't been easy. The arrival of so many Venezuelans has put a strain on Colombia's hospitals. And many of the migrants sleep on the streets, creating tensions with the police and locals. Yet there's been a serious effort to integrate them. In July, then-President Juan Manuel Santos gave temporary residence to 440,000 Venezuelans, allowing them to work and study. His successor, Iván Duque, has suggested giving $300 million in aid to the migrants. And last month, Colombia and Peru agreed to create a database to help manage the migrants. They hope it'll stop Venezuelans from applying for residency in multiple countries. But Colombia says it's still in urgent need of aid. So is the migrant crisis in South America being ignored? And can Colombia and other countries in the region do more to help the Venezuelans? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Caracas is Christian Visnes. He's the Regional Director for the Norwegian Refugee Council in Colombia. Christian, good to have you on the program. How bad is the situation of people pouring across the border?
Well, it's becoming a large-scale crisis, clearly. UNHCR is reporting more than 2.3 million people that have now migrated throughout the region. And particularly in Colombia, this has a huge impact. Government of Colombia is reporting almost 1 million people now from Venezuela that have migrated. And these people are migrating to a country already in conflict. So this is a huge challenge. and becoming a large-scale crisis.
Are they refugees or are they economic migrants?
People are fleeing from very difficult conditions. There is, of course, discussion if what is their status. Most people that we talk to are fleeing from economical hardship of different. The difficulty of accessing any kind of services in Venezuela is mainly what are pushing people to migrate throughout the region. Of course, it is important to also notice that Venezuela is now having one of the historically worst statistics when it comes to violence. So also many people talk about facing situations of crime. That is also an element when they decide to migrate throughout the region.
And what awaits them on the other side in Colombia? Are they getting enough help? What do they still need?
It's clear to us that the international community need to scale up the support for these people. These are people that have lived through difficult situations for years due to the economical hardship and have all kinds of needs, and are coming to a country which is already struggling to support their own internal refugees, their IDPs. We in Colombia already work with thousands of people that have been internally displaced, and those are also struggling to get access to health, access to education. So it's clear that Colombia have a huge challenge and cannot do this by themselves.
There was a declaration in Quito where 11 nations committed to an integrated approach. Does that encourage you? What are we going to see happen on the ground that shows that coming into effect?
It is encouraging when people show, I think, solidarity. They also show that they understand that this is not a problem for one country. This is a regional challenge that needs to be solved together between countries, showing solidarity, showing support to people in need. So we are encouraged by the fact that countries keep their borders open. They allow people to cross borders and to seek better and help in different countries. It's clear, though, that more efforts, more resources, also from the reception countries, need to be put in place. But they also need a much stronger support. We are already working in different locations throughout the region, supporting people, but they need much more. And they also need to be included. They need to get regularized, to be able to find work and to integrate wherever they choose to go.
Okay, and one of the arguments, not only for this, but in a general sense, we've seen it with Palestinians who are displaced and elsewhere, is that if you make them too regular, if you allow them to take root in a place, then you lose the incentive to go back home. Is that something that needs to be taken into account?
For us, it's the situation of each individual. People are entitled to, they have human rights, they are entitled to have health services, to have a dignified life wherever they go. So that means that they need to be able to access health service. They need to get their children back to the school. We are, for example, helping people so that they can access education. Families and children that have been out of education for sometimes for 2 years. This is critical that they can rapidly access all kinds of social services, because if you don't, for example, in education, after 2 years, you're already losing your opportunity and you are creating a generation that have lost their opportunity for a proper education. So this is something you have to think about day by day. And it's a complex situation. We don't see any change in the situation in the short run. So I think what we need to think about is their situation today. And then we will have to, and hope the nations can work together so they can be able to return, because I think that's what everybody wants. All Venezuelans wants to return and wants to live in dignity.
Okay, Christian Visnes, I thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Well, to further the discussion, I'm joined now from Bogota by Senator and member of the Democratic Center Party, Paloma Valencia. Also in the Colombian capital is journalist Dylan Badur, who's been covering the refugee crisis. And in Washington, D.C., we have Serena Sanchez. She's a human rights advocate at the Washington office on Latin America, an advocacy organization advancing human rights in the Americas. Thank you all for joining us on The Newsmakers. Dylan, let me begin with you. We heard from the Norwegian Refugee Council that the scale is, in a way, underestimated by the international community. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, very likely. It's hard to get precise numbers on the migration that's happening here because so much of it is undocumented and crossing an open border into Colombia. But it does seem like the world is steadily coming to recognize, how big of a crisis this is facing the region.
Paloma Valencia, Senator, can your government cope with the crisis right now? The foreign minister is saying that Colombia cannot deal with the situation alone. Is that a plea for help?
Yeah, absolutely. We need the help of the region. This is a problem that it's a concern from all the region and all the world. Colombia has a lot of troubles hanging all these Venezuelans who are welcome in the country, but it's a lot of burden for the Colombian government because, for example, talking about the health, the attention in the health system of Colombia is costing the government more than $250 million, which is a huge investment, and it is coming in a point of the economical crisis also in Colombia because the last government left us a lot of debts.
And is it fair, because we just heard from the Norwegian Refugee Council, Christian Visnes there, is it fair from him to suggest, Senator, that it would be good for Colombia to make these economic migrants or refugees, whatever you want to call them, more regular, to allow them access to, or more access to healthcare, more access to schools, especially for the children? Yes, long term, we want the situation in Venezuela to get better and for them to go home, but for the moment, can Colombia do better to make them more regular? Is that fair?
We have to do it. I think this is a solidarity issue, and we have a link to the Venezuelan people that we will try to fulfill. But of course, we have a lot of difficulties in the fiscal situation of our country. That's why our president, Iván Duque, is calling all the presidents of the region and all the nations in the world to see how delicate the situation is. We think there should be shares in all the countries of Latin America and Central America so the Venezuelan people can go to different places and not only to Colombia. At this point, we're taking more or less 30% of the migrants, and that's a huge difficulty for the country. We're willing to help Venezuela, but we'll need the help of the other countries of the region.
Yeah, and that's going to be really interesting to see how that works because most of them just, cross the bridge, Simon Bolivar Bridge, and cross over, given the proximity. Serena Sanchez, is Colombia doing all it can for these desperate people?
Well, I think that Colombia has expressed a lot of goodwill, and it should do that given that over the past 50 years of conflict, Venezuela has received many Colombian refugees. However, I think that it doesn't have the full capacity to be able to meet such a huge challenge. A lot of the institutions along the border are very weak. In some departments, they've suffered through serious issues of corruption and mismanagement. And I also think that given the tremendous challenges it's facing just in implementing its own peace accord and addressing its own 7 million displaced people, that it really is going to need a tremendous amount of support from the international community and from international NGOs to meet the demands that these Venezuelans are bringing in.
Dylan Badur, what do you suggest the Colombians do in order to better help these people?
Well, the big challenge here is definitely documentation, regularizing many of the migrants, which Colombia did a pretty good, they've made a pretty solid effort. In the last months, they did a census registering, I think more than 40,000 undocumented Venezuelans in the country. And this, the fact that many come without a passport or any type of official documentation poses big problems, registering them for school and such things as that. And it's really a challenge to get documentation for people who arrive and have none. But I do agree with what Jimena says, that the country is really pressed here, and it's certainly not, wealth is not overflowing here to deal with a situation like this. And so as far as services like health and education, the country won't reasonably be able to just provide unlimited services to 1 million, or very likely many more than that, people just coming into the country.
Okay, so Paloma, I want you to sink your teeth now into the politics here. You might have heard what the Vice President of Venezuela said, Delcy Rodriguez. This is a quote. Individual officials, this was to the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, by the way. Individual officials have been portraying a normal migratory flow from Venezuela to Colombia as a humanitarian crisis to justify an intervention. That's how they see it in the corridors of power in Caracas. Your response to that is what?
Well, you cannot try to understand what the regime is thinking, because every time something very bad is happening in Venezuela, they have a very weird answer for what's happening. I think they know that they are failing, that they fail absolutely, and that Nicolás Maduro is a dictator that is turning over all the rights of the Venezuelan people. And now they're trying to keep a speech about how everybody's against them, and that's why they're failing. But they failed because they chose a bad politician and bad policies for the Venezuelan people. So what I think is that the international organizations should act against Venezuelan regime and should push an election, but a real election in Venezuela, so that we can have really this regime gone, and we have a free government that will try to rebuild Venezuela.
Jimena, is there a kernel of truth in what the Vice President said, or are the Venezuelan leadership just in denial about the actual crisis that's happening in their country and forcing their people into becoming refugees?
I think that Venezuela needs to own up to the fact that they've generated a tremendous humanitarian crisis that's led to chronic malnutrition, has led to people not having their money be worth anything, so that they're forced to flee across the borders. And I think that they need to work on figuring out some kind of solution to the problem. We think that that solution could be a politically negotiated solution. The history of military intervention and coups throughout Latin America and the history is really not the way to go. However, I think denying the problem is just not going to go away. They need to accept humanitarian assistance within their country, and the international communities to figure out an integrated approach that really is an operationalized shared responsibility among countries. Colombia cannot take on the full burden of this. And it's not only reaching Colombia, it's reaching many other countries in the region, including Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and other areas. So I totally disagree with that statement.
Dylan, is there denialism from the Venezuelans, and is that denialism making it worse?
Yeah, it's hard to say what's making it worse, because the situation's just kind of spiraling out of control. But it's definitely an illegitimate denial. I mean, I work a lot from the border there, seeing thousands of people cross every day. And, you know, the Venezuelan president, Nicolás Maduro, says things like the Venezuelans who are leaving with $5,000 in their pockets, which is absolutely not true. And it certainly does not help the situation that Venezuela is entirely unable to collaborate. You know, for example, the Colombian Migration Authority, they've told me that it's been several years, perhaps 2 or 3 years, since they've had any collaborative communication with Venezuela's Migration Authority, because Venezuela insists that this news of a massive exodus is fabricated, you know, as part of the imperialist conspiracy. So definitely the people charged with helping this situation do not expect to look to Venezuela to Venezuelan authorities for any sort of aid or help or collaboration in dealing with this.
And Dylan, from the people you spoke to on the border as they stream across, what do they tell you? I mean, do they have political views about what's going on back home? Or are they merely telling you, listen, I can't feed my kids anymore. I need to go to a place that's better for that to happen. What are they talking about? Is it more hand to mouth? Is it ideological? Is it political? What is it?
There are plenty of people coming across the border who voted for the late Venezuelan president Hugo Chavez in his day. And that, you know, there's been a change of heart on that front. People say it takes a solid month of work to earn enough money to buy a big bag of rice or a big bag of flour. And, you know, most people are leaving with the hope of going abroad and making money to support their families back home. Of course, there's pretty much unanimous support to remove President Nicolas Maduro from power. But really no conceivable means of doing that at the moment, and no opposition organized in a strong enough fashion to do that. So many people think their only hope is to leave, simply to make enough money for them to eat and to send money home to their families. And, you know, just coming across the border in Colombia, they say, here you can work for a day and make the equivalent of about $3 US, which is 10,000 Colombian pesos. Send it home, and that's enough to eat for 2 weeks. So it's hard to dissuade them from this migration.
Paloma, do you feel that the world has ignored this crisis and that you're shouldering the burden while nobody really cares about it, or they have their priorities elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. This crisis has been growing all over these past years, and we have been, from our party, denouncing the abuses of the regime against the Venezuelan people. But if you see the OEA and all the international organizations were unwilling to vote against the government of Venezuela. Even our president, Juan Manuel Santos, denied the vote against Venezuela because there are serious issues in Venezuela happening from a long time, and everybody was trying to not look at it. And now we're dealing with a huge crisis, a tragedy, you may say, because all these people are coming here without any food, without any perspective of the future, with children. And this country, which is willing to take them in, don't have the resources to do it in the way it should be done.
And Jimena, looking at the politics again, and the context that is created by the Venezuelan government when they see themselves under siege, particularly from the West. It doesn't really help, does it, when we have the New York Times, for example, come out with a report that shows that Trump administration officials were meeting with disgruntled Venezuelan military officers to discuss a coup plot and stuff. It doesn't help those people who are fleeing for a better life, because it just makes the government double down, doesn't it?
Well, yes, but the important thing about that New York Times report to note is that they met, but they didn't agree with taking military intervention. And so in Washington, our officials tend to meet with many different people and many different voices to get an understanding of what's going on. That doesn't mean that there was definitely a plan on the part of the U.S. at least. Yes, those sorts of situations don't help because especially stuff done by the Venezuelan opposition or other groups that are trying to change the government in a forceful way only become, fodder for Maduro to, stick his heels in and not address the real problems that he has in front of him, which is a severe financial crisis, a severe humanitarian situation, and a completely unsustainable situation that is continuing to implode.
And I'm going to circle back to the very beginning, to the question that I asked the member of the Norwegian Refugee Council. Paloma Valencia, are these people economic migrants or are they refugees?
I don't know if you can distinguish between both of the situations. There are people who are going out of their country because they don't have any future and any options. Nobody goes out of their country if they have options to stay there. So what we're facing here, even if it's an economic crisis or refugees, It's a humanitarian crisis. I will say it needs that all the world turns their eyes to Venezuela and Colombia and help these people who really need help.
Yeah, that's right. More than 2.5 million people, according to some estimates, have left Venezuela in search of a better life. It's not great for them, and it's a growing and brewing crisis. We'll be keeping a close eye on the situation, especially on the border between Venezuela and Colombia. For the moment, I have to thank all of you because I have to move on. Paloma Valencia, Dylan Badur, and Jimena Sanchez, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the program, Cambodia's opposition leader is released on bail after a year behind bars. But will it have any impact on the country's democracy? And sexism in sport. Was Serena Williams a victim of prejudice or just a sore loser?
His message through me is that nothing except thank you. He thanks the Cambodian people, his supporters, local and international media. That's his few words.
It's been a tough time for the face of Cambodia's opposition. Last year, Kem Sokha was arrested and jailed after being accused of treason. But after spending 12 months behind bars, he's been released on bail and placed under house arrest. Sokha was detained as Cambodia was preparing for elections. It meant that Prime Minister Hun Sen ran virtually unopposed and secured another 5-year term. But after significant foreign criticism, Hun Sen has been forced to take action and release some of his political opponents. So, is this a step forward for Cambodia? Well, joining me from Rabat in Morocco is Mou Sokhwa. She's the vice president of the dissolved opposition Cambodia National Rescue Party. Sokhwa, good to have you on the program once again. How do you feel after 1 year Kem Sokha has been released? Are you happy?
I would not use the word release. He has been shifted from solitary confinement to house arrest, facing very, very strict restrictions, such as he's forbidden from making contacts with us, from any political activities, and any move he has to report to the court, and the court can take him back to the solitary confinement anytime.
So from the outside looking in, we see it's not just him, even though he's the highest profile political prisoner. 20 others released, I guess, some shifted to house arrest. You know, technically we can debate that, but from the outside looking in, it seems as if Hun Sen is opening things up a bit. He's loosening things up a bit. Is that true?
I would not call it loosening up until Cambodia can come back to democracy, and democracy is restored, and it cannot be done step by step and be prolonged. We must go back to democracy, and the people of Cambodia have already demanded change through free and fair elections and not through sham election.
Did Hun Sen just basically do the ingenious move of locking up all his opponents until the election? He won the election, and now, well, he doesn't have to actually have them in prison per se because there's no election and he has all the power. Is that the reality?
The reality, yes, his own scenario to win all the 125 seats, to make the parliament a one-party parliament. The whole country is now under his control. However, what he does not have, and he needs desperately, is legitimacy. He is about to travel to outside of Cambodia in the democratic world, and therefore he needs to make things look good, but things do not look good at all. And the international community, as well as the people of Cambodia, demand democracy, real democracy, and not fake democracy.
And so the CPP took all 125 seats in that National Assembly, as you mentioned. Your party, the main opposition, not only was it banned, it was dissolved. It doesn't exist anymore. With all of that in mind, how do you plan on opposing Hun Sen? What are you going to do?
We have two main elements that work with us. Mainly, half of the country are still with us. The people are determined to move toward peaceful change with this, demanding re-election. Second, the international community has spoken with one voice, coordinated efforts moving toward restricted sanctions and maybe more. In the next few days and tomorrow, the European Parliament will implement resolutions on the release of Mr. Kem Sokha, and the EU Commission is looking at the assessments on its privileges, the Cambodia privileges for free trade with the EU.
If your party is allowed to reconstitute and becomes unbanned or undissolved, if that's possible, would you play ball with Hun Sen? Would you engage with him? Would you work on reform with him?
Of course. We have a very, very important document, which is the Paris Peace Accord, signed by the main signatories in 1991. And in the Paris Peace Accord that Mr. Hun Sen also signed, call for genuine elections and for free, fair elections and multi-party democracy. Therefore, we do already have a document and we have a constitution as well. We can work on that, and that is the only way to get Cambodia back on track, and democracy is necessary for Cambodia to go back on track, for the people of Cambodia to move towards sustainable development, real and real peace.
A year ago, Kem Sokha went to prison for treason. There was talk of a potential plot for a color revolution sponsored by the West. He was seen as an agent of the West, and meeting with Americans and other members of your party as well were seen as agents of the West. Is that still how your party is seen by the ruling party, by Hun Sen?
Any critic of the government is called a member of this so-called color revolution. Mr. Hun Sen intends to keep his power. He is a dictator. To undo that, we need the international community to continue to speak with one voice and to transform their resolutions and statements into real actions, which is targeted sanctions and other measures that will make Mr. Hun Sen understand that he is not recognized as the legitimate leader of Cambodia.
You mentioned the Europeans are taking this seriously and are criticizing the government, and you must be heartened by that. But is the reality, the geopolitical reality, that for as long as this government has China's support, nobody can really do anything?
It's not true. I think even China will have to realize that Mr. Hun Sen can lose his power because the opposition has very strong support of the people, more than half of the country. And 70% of the people of Cambodia are under the age of 35, very young population, and the youth want change, positive change for their life, for their education, for their employment, and for their future. Yep. They want change, and we're ready for it.
For the sake of clarity, how do we know that more than half of the country supports the opposition?
In 2013 and in 2017, the two main elections were conducted. The opposition party won over 45% of the votes, and the people continue to express very strong opposition toward Mr. Hun Sen. We had called for a boycott, and it was successful. And even though the elections were sham, people took the risk to join our call for boycott.
Musa Hua, thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
Thank you.
Well, joining me now from London is Charlie Eccleshare. He's a journalist at Telegraph Sport. And in Chicago, we have Alan Linton. He's an academic and host of All Sports on WHPK, a non-profit community radio station. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. We don't always do sports stories, and I guess the reason we're doing this story is because it's not quite a sports story. Scandals spawn more scandals, spawn discussion. And at the heart of it all was a point docked and then a game docked. Charlie, was it the correct decision from the chair umpire to dock Serena Williams a point and then a game?
I think it was, yeah. I think in isolation, all three of the incidents were made correctly, and applying the letter of the law, they amounted to the game penalty. It's possible he could have acted with more discretion. He could have been more lenient, but there's absolutely an argument to say he acted in the right way and applied the rules as he saw fit. And I think he could leave the Arthur Ashe Stadium on Saturday with his head held high.
Alan Linton, she violated the rules of the game. She got penalized, no more, no less. Those are the rules of the game. It's nothing bigger than that. What do you think?
It's a little bit bigger than that. Certainly by the letter of the law, absolutely the penalties apply. But I think the larger context is do we see a fair application of the rules, a fair application and leniency from chair umpires between the women's game and the men's game? I think overall, throughout the U.S. Open and overall in tennis, I think the answer is no. And that's the part that I think has really grappled a lot of people's attention on this tennis story.
Okay, so Charlie, there isn't a fair, uniform application, and there's a double standard at play. Would you agree with that?
I would say there's inconsistency across the board. And absolutely, there are cases where men get away with a huge amount, and that's absolutely not fair. But it varies within the men's game as well, and there's a huge amount of favoritism shown towards the top players. You know, it takes a lot more courage for an umpire to take on the likes of, say, Rafael Nadal or Roger Federer.
But that you make your point there. I mean, you make Alan's point there because she's the top of the top, right? She's not just, you know, the best player over the past 5 years. She's the best player over the past, 15 years or so. So by that theory, the umpire should be really intimidated by her and probably favor her, kind of give her kind of home advantage at all times, right?
There's an issue, though, because the problem is there's inconsistency between umpires even. And so Carlos Ramos, the umpire in charge on Saturday, is known for being one of the strictest, one of the biggest sticklers for the rules. And he's one of the very few umpires who in the past has taken Nadal, Murray, Djokovic to task. So it was unfortunate for Serena that she was up against someone who is like that. We know he's like that. The people who put him in charge know he's like that. And the issue comes that you've got an umpire like Mohamed Layani doing something entirely opposite. Early the previous week, he'd come down in his chair and given Nick Kyrgios a pep talk, which is a terrible look for the sport. But that's not really Carlos Ramos's fault. His style is to be down the line, go with the rules, and it was a perfect storm that it happened to be with Serena on that women's final.
Alan Linton, she said that this happened just because I am a woman. I'm a bit annoyed that we don't have a woman on the panel. We did try. But she said, just because I'm a woman, he did this to me. Would you back that fully, unequivocally, that that's the way it was and that was the context behind Carlos Ramos's behavior as the umpire?
I don't think I can back that claim entirely. Certainly, as pointed out, Carlos Ramos is an incredibly strict letter of the law umpire, and I think his decision making in this process can be questioned, but that is just his decision making. I think the larger space, though, that we're engaging in is thinking about how we, as a society, and how tennis has marketed and branded their star players with respect to their confrontations with chair umpires, their place in the game. And so my contention is much more with the idea of an umpire in a final with history on the line, stepping in and inserting himself into the contest. And if we look at the arc of tennis and the arc of sports, oftentimes the leniency or the lack thereof, not just from one chair, but across umpires. Look at Elise Cornet earlier in the U.S. Open, be penalized for changing her shirt in the sweltering heat. That's something that's not often, hardly ever equally penalized. So right. Carlos Ramos may be someone that would give out the same punishment there, but we've seen over the years that that's just not the case.
Okay, so Charlie, in football, I know there was criticism of Mark Clattenburg and other refs that people felt that they tried to be bigger than the game, or they tried to make themselves the sort of center of attention, right? Would you maybe then agree with Alan's argument that we're seeing in the women's game, umpires do this more often than they do in the men's game, where they try to take center stage and exert their authority a bit more? And maybe that's where the sexism or the claims of sexism reside.
Well, I think there are so many things at work here, but one thing that always stuck with me about officiating was reading an interview with the legendary football referee Pierluigi Collina. And he said one of the biggest myths about officiating is that you've had a good game if you haven't been noticed. He said that's just categorically not true. If you have to make big calls, you're going to be noticed, but you still have to make them. You can't make yourself invisible. I think, Ramos in this case, yes, this is the thing, it's not clear cut. Another umpire on another day would have shown more discretion, would have been more lenient, and that's not necessarily wrong. But they are human beings as well, umpires. They have different styles. And I honestly don't think, given how well respected he is, given he has no history of sexism or misogyny, that was what it was. I think, yes, he is someone who applies the rules strictly, and I think, as has been demonstrated, he does that with men's matches as well. And also, can I just make a point? There is so much sexism in tennis, so much, and there are so many issues that should have been raised previously and haven't had the same amount of coverage. And that's understandable because Serena Williams is a huge name. But I think for organizations like the USTA and the WTA to come out and publicly humiliate an umpire of theirs really is absolutely wrong. And I feel they're bandwagon jumping, and they need to look at themselves as well, because there have been a lot of issues with sexism that they haven't really spoken out.
Okay, so Alan, are they using this as an opportunity to maybe sort of brush all the other stuff under the carpet, the stuff they should have addressed beforehand? Whereas this one, I mean, you're saying yourself, it's not absolutely clear-cut, right? On a scale of those saying it's complete sexism to the other end of the scale where people are saying she's just throwing a tantrum, I guess there's arguments within that sort of realm, right? But are they bandwagoning? And this might not be the most exact, direct example of sexism, Alan.
Well, this becomes the big problem with the story, and to some degree, the downside of it involving Serena Williams. She's such a big name, so you can put the spotlight on the double standard as she did, but because it's such a fraught superstar in the sport, there does appear to be a kind of pushing, and I would go as far to say scapegoating on just Carlos Ramos, the idea being that he needs to deal with his own particular understanding and interpretations of the rules. But overall, the larger point about sexism, at least in tennis, extends not just to the on-court officiating, which we've seen certainly at the U.S. Open and certainly over the years involving other players, including Serena Williams, her sister Venus Williams, but also the way we think about and the images and conversations around women in the sport. You think back to the French Open and the so-called catsuit that she wore, and the idea that coming into the U.S. Open, that some part of the conversation was the French Open changing their wardrobe standards. In large part, it seems because of what Serena Williams wore at this year's French Open. And so just the idea that we have a different standard of how women should dress, how they should look, the notion that she threw a tantrum when in the men's game, certainly there have been historic players, John McEnroe, chief among them, where their anger has been a part of their branding. It shows passion. I think the conversation around what we do and how we think about not just the on-court play, but everything from walking out and the perceptions of how they should look, feel, dress, and behave speak to the climate of sexism in tennis.
Alan, did you see the Herald Sun, the Australian cartoon, afterwards?
I unfortunately did.
Right, so as I said beforehand, you know, sort of controversy spawns more controversy. That is deemed by many to be a racist cartoon. It shows her, perhaps, you know, and some people have looked at it historically and they say there's echoes of blackface and other caricatures of black people in the past. She's throwing a tantrum, there's a dummy, she's spitting the dummy on the court and so forth. That's by Mark Knight, who's defended himself, his employers defended him. Do you believe there's an element of... I don't know how to ask this. Do you believe race is also central to this beyond issues of sexism, especially as this has played out?
It's hard for me not to see race as a part of everything, just as the nature of engaging in kind of a larger global society. But I think for this particular cartoon, it absolutely strikes me as racist and racially offensive, particularly because Serena Williams and her body have always been a topic of conversation in the press. Certainly accusations from when she was younger on the junior tour that she may have been a man, to her not having the same quote-unquote traditional physique that we see of other tennis players, other more marketable tennis players like a Maria Sharapova. And so it's hard for me not to disentangle the history and legacy specifically to Serena with respect to body shaming and the racial history behind that. But yeah, it struck me as incredibly insensitive and very much so racially offensive and racist.
Charlie, what did that cartoon tell us?
That there's a huge amount of racism and ignorance in this world, and that I don't live there, so I can't say for 100%, but from what I hear from people who live there, Australia, there are real issues with this. And I think this underlined that. And then the response of the newspaper to double down on it and to, re-emphasize the point was sickening, and does reflect what's been said, that this has been an issue in tennis for a long, long time. And Serena, was booed in Indian Wells, in her home country. Serious racial overtones there, and it's been there throughout. And to see that it's still there in 2018 is disappointing. I think we all hope that we were maybe moving beyond that, and that's why everything that's happened on Saturday, it's been this powder keg that's exploded, and so many issues have come back to the surface. And this being the most egregious example of that.
Alan, what can we learn from this entire scandal and its fallout?
I think we can learn that even though you can be arguably the greatest women's tennis player and one of the greatest athletes of all time, that doesn't prevent other people creating a larger moment for what's happening. Certainly here in the United States, there seems to be large divisions between Serena fans, people pushing back against suggestions of racism and sexism, and then people that are just fans of tennis that are kind of caught in between, debating the rules and what have you. I think the frustrating part here is that it takes a large failure in the largest stage to have a conversation that's long overdue about sexism and racism and consistency between the men's and women's game.
Okay. Charlie Eccleshare and Alan Linton, it's been good to talk to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us here on the Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Russia kicks off their biggest war games in decades. Are they merely threatening the West or preparing for a global war? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.